In recent years, there is a growing number of Peranakans in Singapore who adamantly say they are Chinese. They claim that the Peranakan culture is an acculturation, that there has been no proof of actual Malay Chinese or Indonesian Chinese intermarriages. They say that overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia adopted the Malay and Indonesian cultures and heritage to make living in their adopted country more viable. Oh, so scary to think that our culture might have a Malay base. Well, I hate to break it to these people, but our base is in the kampong, not in the forbidden city.
Hello, good evening everyone. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. And if I'm having an amazing day, you should be having an amazing day. And if you're having an amazing day, my Tuan Kecik is also having an amazing day. Stop it, William! Stop it! Stop! There's a very troubling trend that I've noticed that has overtaken the Baba Nyonya community for the last couple of decades. And this trend has bedeviled the collective psyche of our community for well over 30 years. And this trend is what I like to describe as the museum curator trend, or the sanitization trend of making Baba Nyonya culture palatable towards outsiders in order to give it more market value. Yes, let me give you an example of such a trend. Okay, this is a book entitled Once Upon a Kamcheng. Now, I have my criticisms of this book. This book, it doesn't seem to highlight the working class experience of the Baba Nyonya community, and it tends to focus on the lives of the elites and gives you a very, very skewed view of the Baba Nyonyas, right? But that's not my only issue with this book. Granted, it was mostly accurate because it accurately reflects the life of Penang Babas, although I would have appreciated it if it had come with a glossary so I could understand the Hokkien terms. Anyway, I'm going to take a part of this book to show you what I mean. There are two parts of the book that I want to address. The first part is in the introduction. Now, in the second page of the introduction, it says here, the Penang Baba Nyonya culture is a charming blend of Chinese, Nusantara, and European cultures with inspirations from Thai, Burmese, Indian, and others who called at this port city for over the centuries. It kept the Chinese form in traditions and identity, while its social practices were localized in essence. These were superimposed on one another, and the Baba Nyonyas easily made the transition from one to another. Now, the first thing you'll notice in this paragraph is that there is one very, very glaringly obvious detail that's missing, and that is the 5-letter M word. I wonder what that word could be. Could it start with an M and end with a Y? Yes, that is correct. They mentioned Chinese, Nusantara, and European cultures, and Thai, Burmese, and Indian cultures as inspiration, but no mention in this paragraph of Malay influence, which is the cradle of the Baba Nyonya civilization in the Strait settlements. Yes, the Malay world is indeed the cradle of our civilization, and yet, curiously, there is not a single mention of the word Malay in any of these paragraphs. Yes, let's see. They spoke in Baba Hokkien, no mention of Baba Malay either. I don't speak Hokkien. The interiors of their homes are decorated with Chinese lattice screens, mother-of-pearl furniture, Minton tiles, Chinese porcelains, and local utensils and baskets in the kitchen. Well, sure, if you're a rich Baba or Nyonya who's drowning in money, yes, that would indeed be your life, but not every Baba or Nyonya is a crazy rich Asian, and in fact, many of them are in fact working class people trying to make a living just like any of you. But from what I can see is that there is a very, very troubling trend, I will say, of people in the Baba and Nyonya community trying to make the identity more palatable to the Chinese diaspora, because that's where the market share is. Now, I'm not saying all Chinese people are rich, but what I do know is that the strongest customer base in this country is in fact the Chinese customer base, because they're the ones with the spending power, right? As well as the expat base. But what I'm seeing, and what I'm sure many of us are noticing, is this trend of decentering from Nusantara and basically recentering on the cynic world. Ergo, making the Baba Nyonya culture and identity seem more Sinicized and less Malayanized, which is basically a betrayal of its kampong roots, of the fact that our ancestor was a rugged, rough and sunburned sailorman who came to Nusantara to get away from the feudal and classist structures of Chinese society and find freedom on this land. Yes, the Peranakan identity, and the word Peranakan is itself a Malay word which means born of this soil, was not born in the cold and miserable alleyways of Beijing. No, it was born on this soil, on this warm and fertile soil called Nusantara. Because the Peranakan people, whether they be the Chettis or the Baba Nyonya people, I should say the Baba Nyonya people in this regard, are not simply another branch of the Chinese tree. We are an independent tree unto ourselves. But lately, there have been many younger generation Peranakans, or more specifically, younger generation Babas and Nyonyas, to make their culture seem less uncool and more palatable to the mainstream Chinese diaspora, whether that be in Southeast Asia or the West, to make it less uncool and more palatable to the Chinese diaspora. They try to make it seem as if, hey, we're just like you with a couple of extra flavors. But that is not the reality of the Baba and Nyonya culture. I'm going to read to you a passage that I found on a blog that was written by some Babas and Nyonyas in Malaysia. I won't state which blog it is because I don't want to throw my own people under the bus. But this passage is quite concerning because it shows a symptom of creeping Sinicization on the Baba Nyonya identity, which is uncalled for by anyone. And frankly, it is a misrepresentation of what we truly are.
Most Peranakans have lived for generations along the Straits of Malacca and not all intermarried with the local native Indonesians and Malays. Well, we know that there's a small percentile of Babas and Nyonyas who don't have any trace of Indonesian or Malay blood. Now, they might have Thai blood, they might have Cambodian blood, but no Malay blood. Oh, so I can see there's some racial anxieties about Southeast Asian blood already. The same kind of anxieties that Lim Boon Keng had, you know. Mostly are of Hokkien ancestry, although a sizable number of Teochew or Cantonese descent. Okay, fine. Originally, the Peranakan were mixed-race descendants, part Chinese, part Malay or Indonesian. But you mentioned in the earlier part of the paragraph that not all of them were mixed-race. So you were trying to stress that, you know, not all of them were contaminated with Southeast Asian blood. Peranakans were usually traders, the middlemen of the British and the Chinese. Well, if we're talking about the Strait settlements, then yes. But if we're talking about those in, I don't know, places like Kelantan and Terengganu, maybe not. Or the Chinese and Malays, or vice versa, due to the fact that they were mostly English educated. Why, thank you. There we go. That's how I got my accent, isn't it? That I inherited from my Penang Free School grandfather. Because of this, they almost always had the ability to speak 2 or more languages. However, in later generations, some lost the ability to speak Chinese. Lost the ability to speak Chinese, as if we hadn't outgrown that diaspora Chinese anxiety, as they became assimilated to the Malay Peninsula's culture and started to speak Malay fluently as a first or second language.
Now, just to be clear, the Babas and Nyonyas who don't happen to speak Chinese did not forget how to speak Chinese, because as I've made it clear in many previous circumstances, because as I have made it adequately clear, Peranakan people are not bananas, because we don't measure ourselves by Chinese yardsticks. No Baba or Nyonya who is culturally Peranakan would use the Chinese diaspora yardstick of measuring their own sense of self-worth. I'm going to make another video explaining why, if you're still fixated on Chinese identity and you're still obsessed about losing Chinese identity, then you can't call yourself culturally Peranakan, because to be a Peranakan means to be someone who has outgrown the diaspora anxiety of clinging on to China, okay? But the way these people framed it was that the Peranakans who don't happen to speak Chinese, whether that be Hokkien or Mandarin or Teochew or whatever, are people who somehow forgot how to speak Chinese. This is a misinterpretation, or this is a misrepresentation of who we really are. Because, put it this way, the Japanese people are their own unique tree. Nobody in their right mind would call the Japanese people Chinese people who happened to eat a lot of raw fish, right? Now, it's true that the Japanese people have got Chinese ancestors, no doubt. It was, I believe, a gentleman by the name of Xu Fu who was sent to the islands of Penglai in order to find the immortality pill for the first emperor of China. But Xu Fu was naturally unsuccessful, because there's no such thing as an immortality pill, and under the autocratic Lee Kuan Yew system of don't question your father figure, well, you can't return home to the emperor empty-handed. So what do? You settle down on the islands of Penglai, and eventually Xu Fu's descendants become the Japanese people. Yes. And eventually they developed their own language, writing system, culture, norms that were syncretic and rooted to the land. And they no longer considered themselves Chinese people after several generations, you see. So the same is said about the Peranakans. We have our own language, Baba Malay. Baba Malay is not another branch of the Chinese language. It is not a Chinese dialect. It is a unique Creole language that originated in Nusantara. And Baba Malay is not simply broken baku. It's not simply broken Malay.
Tuan kecil tersandar atas katil yang besar. Boy carek pasal dengan kucing yang liar. Lu ingat lu harimau dalam bilik dia. Tapi lu punya badan dah halus ya.
In fact, some might even say it's actually closer to classical Malay than standardized Malay, but I'm not a linguist. The point is, what I find extremely frustrating is that there is indeed a trend of younger generation Babas and Nyonyas who are basically turning their back on the kampung roots of the Peranakan identity. And this actually did start in the 19th century already, when British anxieties about race started taking root. And some Peranakans, didn't want to be associated with the kampung. They wanted to be associated with a grand and glorious 5,000-year-old civilization. So you had Peranakans like Song Ong Siang and Lim Boon Keng who encouraged the Baba Nyonya people to apparently get back in touch with their roots, because they believed that the Babas and the Nyonyas were deficient without Chinese, because they themselves did not feel confident in their own identity without the Chinese language. They themselves had been trapped in that mental state that bedevils people who do not have a secure sense of self-worth in their own identity. And so they believed that all Peranakans were basically deficient until they became cynicized, so to speak. In fact, Lim Boon Keng actually went to China to lecture after mugging up on Mandarin, and guess what Lu Xun called him? He called him an Englishman who couldn't shut up about Confucius. But the point still stands. I mean, we had community leaders in the 19th century who were already betraying the kampong roots. But what we're seeing in real time is younger generation Babas and Nyonyas, because at least Lim Boon Keng didn't like identifying as a Peranakan, so he wasn't a hypocrite in that regard. But we're seeing young Peranakans, younger generation Babas and Nyonyas, who want the market share of Baba Nyonya culture. They want the market share of the tiles, the furniture, the beautiful aesthetics, the kebayas, the sarongs, but they are uncomfortable with the Malay root. Because, as I've mentioned dozens of times, Malay culture is the base of the Baba and Nyonya identity. Chinese is the topping. Chinese is the optional topping, but Malay is the base. And if you have forgotten that, you have forgotten what it means to be Peranakan, to be of this soil. Now I'll show you another bit from this book that shows you what I mean. I'll show you another part in the book which demonstrates very clearly what I mean by this creeping shifting away of the base from Nusantara to the Chinese world, and basically the abandonment of the Malay root, and making the Baba Nyonya culture seem like just another flavor of Chinese. Okay, look at this page. It says here, the Straits Baba has a saying that family wealth cannot remain in the family through 3 generations. Now seems so true. The first generation worked hard to build the fortune. The second generation was trained by the first to continue with the hard work, but they were indulgent with the third generation. They indulged and gave their progeny what they had missed out on. The third generation indulged in wine, women, and song, spent what they did not earn, and could only engage in nostalgia. The subsequent generations then had to learn the hard way, going back to the first generation's work ethics. Baba saying? Baba saying? That is not a Baba saying. That is a Chinese saying. Yes, that literally comes from a Chinese proverb. Yes, this is literally a Chinese proverb, and it has nothing to do with Nusantaran ethics. Fu Bu Guo San Dai. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrongly, but this literally means that wealth does not last more than 3 generations, and it concerns Chinese economic anxiety, because Chinese economic anxiety was what birthed this proverb in the first place. But the Babas and Nyonyas do not measure worth through prosperity and through wealth in the same way that the Chinese diaspora does. Now, I'm not speaking for all Chinese diaspora. There are many Chinese diaspora people who are artistic and not obsessed with wealth accumulation, true, but generally speaking, the Chinese are far more anxious about wealth and status than the people of Nusantara, because the Chinese come from a very different civilizational ethos from us. But basically what the author of this book was doing was fundamentally trying to recenter the Peranakan experience on China rather than Nusantara. But the point is, in the last couple of decades, we've seen a shift by the Peranakans in the Strait settlements to try and appeal to the Chinese diaspora for, business connections, for job opportunities, for for friendships even, while abandoning the very root of the culture, which is the Malay world. I'm not saying you can't learn Chinese. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that don't learn Chinese, but I'm saying that Chinese is optional. The Chinese identity is simply a topping that you put over the Nusantara identity. However, the Malay base is not optional, because the Malay base is the very cradle of our civilization. And if we lose that, we become no different than another branch of Chinese diaspora people, which goes against the whole civilizational ethos of being Peranakan in the first place. Because our sailorman ancestor, our ancestor didn't sail thousands of miles away so that the very same classes and hierarchical and feudal structures could be transplanted on his own descendants today. He got away from a classist, cruel, and unkind society, and he walked towards freedom in Nusantara and found that freedom on this land, and he joined together in perfect harmony with the lady of this land to create us, the Babas and the Nyonyas. And now you want to appease the descendants of the very Mandarins who made life so unbearable for him in China that he had to leave. I'm sorry, I'm just very upset by this. I'm going to make another video about Pick Me Baba, but the point is, just like the Chinese always like to say, right, don't forget your roots. I must tell my fellow Peranakans who have forgotten their roots, janganlah sebagai kacang yang melupakan kulit. Don't be like a peanut who forgets his skin, to the extent that you want to basically disassociate yourself from the Malay world, because you find that aligning with the Chinese diaspora is more profitable. Because profit comes and goes, like what Confucius says. I'm not being Chinese in this sense, I'm just quoting Confucius. If there were a way to become rich honorably, I would do it. But since there is none, I do as I like. Wealth and status are like fleeting clouds. I would rather be poor and wear rags and eat coarse grain and drink water from a god and sleep with my bent arm as a pillow, rather than sell out my soul for foreign approval. Because at the end of the day, the land that fed your ancestor was not China. The land that welcomed your ancestor and gave him a home and gave him a future was not China. Don't ever forget where you come from.